Hi everyone. So super excited today to be joined by Alishia. Alishia is a licensed mental health therapist based in Maryland. Alicia's been really helpful for me and a massive inspiration in the work that I've been doing around anti-oppression, social justice, and anti-racism, particularly how that intersections with eating disorder recovery. So I'm really excited to have Alishia on the show today. I'm also a member of Alicia's online community, the Holistic Black Healing Collective, which again has just been so helpful for me this past year to have that sounding board, a place where I can just rant and just talk about my whatever's coming up for me, and just it's a real safe space. So we'll talk a bit more about that a little bit later on, but just to say that I'm just so thankful for the work that Alicia's been doing in this space. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And as I've told you before, I just really appreciate being in community with you and just learning from you as well. And so I just appreciate you giving me this opportunity to come on and talk today.
Excellent. So why don't you uh, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that you do, and also your journey as to how you got to where you are today.
Yes. And so, as Keisha said, my name is Alishia McCullough. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a licensed mental health therapist. I'm also a nationally certified counselor. And outside of that work, I'm also a published author. And so, I have published a book of poetry just from experiences I was having. It's about a journey of self love. And so, I do have that out there. Outside of more the kind of clinical or professional work, I also am the founder of Black and Embodied Counseling and Consulting, which is an online business where I do anti racism work, talk about racial healing, body image, and body justice and liberation. And I'm also the founder of the Holistic Black Healing Collective that Keisha was talking about earlier, that she's a member of, which is a community for BIPOC individuals to come together and really have a safe space to just be in community and talk about just a variety of different things. And then I'm also the co founder of Amplify Melanated Voices, which is an online global movement that occurred last summer to raise awareness around the oppression that people that experience marginalization do face, especially those who are melanated, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so those are just a few of the things that I'm doing. How I kind of got to this place was that I went to school for psychology. And when I graduated, I immediately started my master's program and got my master's degree in clinical counseling. And so, in that experience, I was able to work at an internship site that really gave me a lot of experience with a variety of mental health concerns. But what really connected for me was the eating disorders work. And so I had an opportunity to lead a clinical support group for eating disorders, work individually with clients with eating disorders and disordered eating. And from that experience, it really opened me up, and one made me kind of check in with myself and realize that I was dealing with disordered eating, and that it was also showing up in my family and in my friendships. And I didn't realize how prevalent it was. And so that really kind of brought things home for me. And I'm like, well, if I'm experiencing this and other people that I know are experiencing this, then why are we not getting the support and help that we need for it? Because at the time I was seeing a lot of white clients and white people in groups, but wasn't seeing any people of color in those same settings. And so it really got me invested in really advocating and seeing, what does this look like for our communities, what does this look like for me and the people that I'm around. And so that's what's really led me to this journey. It caused me to open up an Instagram page to talk more about it and connect with other folks that are also doing that work. And then really was the thing that propelled the Amplify Melanated movement, which went global. And that's how I was able to kind of branch out and meet more people and have more opportunities to really get out there and learn more about it. And also get my voice out there as well, and like speaking about my own experience.
Yeah, it's amazing. I think that is how I came across you as well. That viral global project you talked about, that Amplify Men Native Voices. I think that's how I came across you. I can't say for sure if I wasn't following you before that. I like to think I was, but I can't prove that. So, but I know for sure it has been that past, over this past year, just to see that growth and to see people really getting behind that I listened to your your podcast. I
Yes.
forget the name of the podcast that you spoke about the year on anniversary.
Oh, the My Black Body podcast?
My Black Body
Yes,
podcast, which I loved that podcast. I think I said to you in one of the comments, one of your posts, had a lot of like, oh my gosh moments where my nervous system
yes,
was just like, you need to pause and
yes,
just let that sink in because you were just dropping some bombs on that
yes.
podcast. And I was just like, yes, oh my gosh, yes, oh my gosh, yes. Some of these things we'll touch on today. But yeah, it was just interesting to see like how many people were behind that hashtag at the beginning and how performative that was in some
Yes,
ways, and how, you know, and where we are 1 year on, those who are still standing and still
yes,
behind it, and those who have disappeared, you know, and stepped
exactly.
back and talking differently now. And that gets me thinking that mean and that's what really got me thinking about eating disorders within the Black community as well, because I noticed the same thing. I at that point was working in an intensive outpatient unit, and I was not seeing any Black clients, not even, as far as I'm aware, not even coming in for assessments in the 3.5 years I was there, leave alone sitting in front of me having conversations about their eating disorders. I know from you know, my own, not my own lived experience, but I've had members of my family suffer from eating disorders, friends, and so I know that it exists in our community. And I was really shocked when I then went on to look at the very limited data on eating
Yes.
disorders in the Black community to see that it is you know, we are as likely to suffer from an eating disorder. And I think there was even some research that said in some instances more so.
Yes,
And even then, I don't know how much that research even looked at the intersectionality between, you know,
exactly.
eating disorders and oppression and racism, you know, racial trauma and social injustices as well. So it just, with that limited research, it often then just means for those of us who are working with Black folks in ED recovery, we are working off of frameworks that are designed for, you know, for white people. Very, very different. There is a difference, and that doesn't get picked up in the way that we've been taught to treat eating disorders. And I just wondered, what's your experience been, of working in this field with Black people?
Yeah. And so I think what really was monumental for me was I was working at a center and I was leading a couple groups. And again, most of the groups comprised of white women, cisgendered women. I did have, you know, in those groups, it'd be like me and one other Black person, you know, that was going through an eating disorder or, you know, or dealing with disorder eating. And I was the facilitator and they were the group members. So that even caused a little bit more isolation. And so I just noticed that in those groups, most of the Black members would be more reserved or quieter and wouldn't maybe feel as if they were a part of the group as much as other white members were. And so I was really intentional about creating connections with that person and trying to align with them so that they would know, like, hey, there's someone here that gets it. You know, there's someone here that can relate. But I will say, even in those groups, when I would bring up social issues, the white members, like it kind of fell, you know, like they didn't recognize it, like they didn't want to hear it, you know. And so there was just one time where I was really intentional about creating a group for Black women. And so I had a group of Black women, there were about five. And that year, when I led that group, I had to support them all in getting a higher level of care, whether that was inpatient hospitalization or going to a residential treatment facility. Um, you know, that was that semester. And what really connected for me was that when Black folks struggle with eating disorders and disorder eating, there's just so many more layers that I think these systems don't really have the capacity, the tools, or the education to really deal with. And so, you know, these were people that were dealing with family and financial issues, but were still being, you know, forced to show up and have to do their, you know, day-to-day things without getting resources around that issue. These were folks that might have had multiple marginalized identities, whether it was, you know, they might have been a Black woman, but they might have been a Black woman who had a disability or a Black woman who also identified as queer. And so there were so many other layers that were not being touched when we were in that group setting because of the system that we were specifically in. And so that really made me start thinking a little bit more about intersectionality and then how that all shows up in eating disorder treatment. And so I recently went to a training. It was called Eating Disorders and PTSD. And it really connected to me because it was like talked about how trauma and PTSD actually cause greater symptoms of eating disorders
Yep.
than like if you were not to have that. And it made me just think like, wow, so like when we talk about racial trauma and we talk about, transphobia or anything related to like disabilities, those are all forms of oppression that are impacting the way people are showing up in their eating disorders and oftentimes in trauma. And so, like, of course, our communities have worser quote unquote outcomes of eating disorders,
Mhm.
but oftentimes we don't really have the language because it's so normalized, right? Like, it's so normalized that our eating is disordered for a variety of reasons that we're just kind of like, oh, that's just how we eat, And like, so I just think about all of that. And that's what really connected to me when I've worked with Black folks and the racial trauma piece, and just the intersectionalities of all of those things coming up in the disordered as well.
Yeah, yeah, so important to think about that. And like, yeah, I totally agree with like the sensations and that comes up from those who are struggling with PTSD, any type of trauma, and how, restriction or binge eating or purging can be a way that a person is trying to regulate the
Yes.
nervous system. And just how I see that a lot within my clients I work. I'm quite interested in polyvagal theory for that
Yes.
reason, because it really, really speaks to the clients that I work with, and it really, really helped me understand, what the experience must be in the body, because I definitely know what anxiety feels like, very different
Mhm.
from PTSD. So I can
Yes.
understand how, that there was a real connection there, sort of understanding how a person is using eating behaviors, exercise behaviors, to try and cope with those
Yes.
what can often be very uncomfortable sensations.
Absolutely. And I think, I'll add to that as well and just say, like, for me, like, of course, I'm looking at the individual in the room. I'm also looking at their environment and, family, culture, all those things that are taking place and other intersectional identities. But something in the past year that I've recently more thought about is like the ancestral and intergenerational components that they're bringing in. And so, like, even when you're talking about that, it really just made me think about how for those of us, especially for Black folks that have a history of enslavement or even colonization, maybe it's not enslavement, but just the colonization piece as well. We've become so disembodied through those experiences. Like our ancestors had to be disembodied to survive some of those experiences. And that was passed on generation to generation to generation. And so when we talk about eating disorders, and not being in our bodies and using these eating disorder behaviors as ways of coping, that's historically maybe all we've really known, just from that ancestral intergenerational lens.
Ooh, I've never thought about the sort of that disconnect and how, I mean, that would have been a way for us just to survive, right? Our
Yes.
ancestors to survive. I hadn't thought about how that could get passed down in that way. That's really, really interesting. Thank you for that. That's going to be my next
Yes.
thing that I just go down a
Yes.
rabbit hole and just keep researching and researching. Really, really interesting. Thank you for that. So that brings us quite nicely onto the name of your practice and your Instagram page, which is Black and Embodied. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So could you describe, or how would you describe the way that embodiment and the role that it plays within eating disorder recovery and racial trauma?
Yeah. When I specifically think about embodiment, for me, it means to return to self. And so when I think about being Black and returning back to yourself, for me, it means unpacking and reclaiming what's ours. And so I don't find it as like an arrival place or a destination. I kind of see it more as like an everyday exercise in a way. I think sometimes when we look at eating disorder treatment, it's very binary where it's like you do these rigid things and you get to this destination. Whereas I think for like when we talk about liberation and keeping taking ourselves out of that binary thinking and rigidity, I think that that really does look like everyday practices. And so for me, returning to myself every day might be in the small things. It could be in like wearing my hair natural. It could be in like deciding to do yoga that day because I need to be in my body before I start the day. It could be just taking a long shower and being intentional about how I'm starting my day. And specifically with the unpacking piece, it looks like unpacking the ways that I've internalized anti-Blackness or white supremacy or any other isms and obias that we are inundated with in this society. It looks like me unpacking that and saying, what were my indigenous, ancestors doing prior to these things being put on us, and so like, so a part of it is the unpacking, and the other part is the relearning. And so I've been really intentional about doing my own family history. I've taken a couple DNA and genetic testing just to figure out where my people are from. And so I've studied some of the cultures and things like that, and tried to like pick up pieces of what feels intuitive. So like if I'm like, I can tell a story. Like 2 weeks ago, I was making some plantains. I know some people are like, they're called plantains, but I say plantains.
Say how you
Um, yes. So I was making these plantains, first time ever making them. And I just had this emotional response to eating them and cooking them. And it just felt so intuitive. And I'm like, huh. And I know that they come from, the country that, when we think about countries and things, I know where they come from. And I'm like, wow, I wonder if that's an ancestral connection there with this food. And it was just such an emotional process for me. And so that is what the returning process for me looks like.
I love that. And everything you said, I'm like, yep, I do that. I do that. Like there's days when I'm just like, this is going to be a long shower.
Yes.
It's going to be a long, hot shower, and I'm
Yes.
going to take all the time I need. And I totally hear on the food piece as well. Like so my on my mum's side, the family's from Jamaica. My dad's side
Yes.
were from Grenada. But
Yes.
there's something about if I'm ever unwell, so if I've got like a cold or anything, that is the food I want. I want Caribbean food. Like that's, it feels like
Yes.
that's the only thing that's going to nourish me in the way that I need to be nourished when I'm sick. And it's
Exactly.
not something I eat every week, but when I'm
Yeah.
ill, 100%, I'm just like, take away. I haven't got the
Yes.
time. Take
Yes.
away, order in my Caribbean food. It takes too long to cook. I don't have the utensil, but yeah, just love it. And it is something about, I always wonder about that, because it wasn't actually food that I necessarily, I grew up eating, but we were, brought up here in London, UK. So I do
Yeah.
wonder about that. That's that pull that just happens quite intuitively,
Yes.
going back to the roots, as it were.
Yes, exactly. And I think even as we, like, you just saying that really made me even think about how even sometimes I think when we think about eating disorders, definitely they're biopsychosocial spiritual illnesses. And I feel like even from what we're talking about, maybe there's a part of it too that's really connected to, for our ancestors, when they were disconnected from their food, their land, their roots. Maybe that could be a part of why this eating is disordered for our communities, because this is not our food, right? Like, this is not ours where we are right now. And so maybe that's a piece of it as well.
Oh, my mind is like, as you're saying that, like I'm getting like, but also my mind is like, I had never thought of that. That's such an
Yes,
interesting point. Literally rejecting that food from this land because it isn't the food. It's not our food.
exactly. Exactly.
Wow. Okay, so I guess that is definitely going to be my next piece of research. I think that's so interesting. Do you follow the Black nutritionist on Instagram?
I do. I love her.
Yeah,
I love
great
Dr.
guy.
Kara.
He just came out guns blazing, as it were, like just like this. And I was just like, oh, she's saying all the things I wish I had. I was brave
Exactly.
enough to say, like,
Exactly. I support her 100%. I love every post.
all the way. She's absolutely brilliant. But that's really got me thinking about, yeah, that whole sort of colonization of,
Yes.
of land and food, and how food is connected to that piece.
Yes.
Um, so when I was talking through you've done some brilliant projects, by the way. I love the work that you do. I know I was all over your religious trauma workshop that you did as well. Again, I think there's something about, I have to say, there's something about here in the UK. It feels like we're always I feel, so people may disagree, but I do feel like we're a little bit behind when it comes to certain conversations around trauma. And
Yeah.
I did not have religious trauma on my radar until I saw that you did the workshop on that with others as well.
Yes.
So thank you for that. But then the other thing, I was looking through your links. I watched that and I thought that was brilliant. It was really helpful for a few of my clients as well. But as I was looking through your links, I noticed that you had one course which I am 100% going to be buying, because I'm just like courses, 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 knowledge, knowledge, knowledge. And that was injected fat phobia in Black communities.
Yes.
So without giving away all the gems of knowledge that I just know are in there, you've done really well in sort of giving it tiered pricing as well. So I think that's brilliant as well. So if anything, people have to go on and buy the course.
Yes,
But
please do.
absolutely, because lots of hard work and research goes into that, and effort and time. tell us a little bit about that course without giving away all the gems. Just tell us a little bit
Yeah.
what we'd expect to see in there.
Absolutely. And so essentially what I do is kind of walk people through the origins of fat phobia,
Mhm.
specifically within Black communities. And so I start off the recording with a lot of information from Sabrina String's book of Fearing the Black Body.
Great
And
book.
so I really lay out for folks like, where did fat phobia come from? And it really came from, in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century when Black bodies were being brought over in chains to be, used and enslaved. Essentially, those folks labeled our bodies and deemed them as like bad and like sensuous and villainized our bodies. And so with that created this whole idea, well, they're over sensatious. They, eat all this food. They don't have a lot of control, quote unquote, over their food consumption. And so this is what we're going to use to justify. Like that's just one thing. Like, of course, it's their skin tone, but also their body size proves that they're like subhuman. They're more animalistic. And so that was some of the justifications for enslavement, especially because when there was a lot of to be honest, I mean, there was a lot of sexual violence occurring when there was enslavement. And so, because of that sexual violence, a lot of people were birthing more biracial or multiracial children who were looking a lot like the slave owners or the oppressors. And so they were like, okay, this is really not working. And so, how do we continue to oppress? And that's where they created, the one drop rule, where if you have one drop of Black blood, especially from your mother, then you're considered a Black person and forever enslaved, and that's when there was the story of Sarah Barton, who was a woman who they brought around the world on an exhibition show and basically had her body on a stand for people to look at and publicly mock or make comments about or sexualize. And because her body traveled all throughout Europe and other parts of the world, and she was a Black woman, people were like, well, that's what Black people look like. And so they're fat, they're this, they're that. And they demonized that word fat and created this whole idea that, again, this is what Blackness is. And so I get into that. And from there, I move a little bit into like what eating disorders are and how they kind of correlate with that a little bit more. And then specifically how different things like healthism in our communities, which is essentially this obsession with health, to the detriment almost of, of our own bodies, but also this hyper judgment and fixation on other people's bodies and making sure they're quote unquote healthy as well. And so I get into all of that. And then talk a little bit about fitness culture as well, because that's a piece of it. And then from there, just kind of lead people out with that information and what can be different when we talk about how to work with folks with eating disorders and to combat injected fat phobia. And so that's a little bit about what the training is about. Kind of goes through a whole like process there.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I absolutely loved Sabrina String's book, and
Yes.
I've been following her work as well. But that book took me a while to get through that first
Oh
part
yeah.
of it. And it's a really tough read in terms of one, she gives such a wealth of information, but also just to think that that was how Black bodies were being regarded and treated, and then beliefs they had about our skin, and even why our skin was the color it was. They
Yes.
talked about there being toxicity and all sorts of bizarre and quite frankly disrespectful and really difficult to read,
Yes.
really in that way, to think that that's how we were regarded and how diet culture was born out of that, out
Exactly.
of the fear, like out of the fear of becoming
Yes.
anything close to the bodies that we have, and wanting to make that very distinct separation between quote unquote them and us,
Yes.
which is yeah, really really hard to swallow. That book was, but fantastic work
Yes.
from Sabrina Strings there. And I'm glad that you're going to fitness culture as well, because it's a whole another thing. I see,
Yes.
I'm a Pilates instructor as well as a nutritional therapist, and I definitely see how that industry also perpetuates that sort of diet. Well, it backs up diet culture, but also has this idea that there are quote unquote right and wrong bodies. And
Exactly. And I find that, when I think about fitness culture, again, not to get too much into it, but I think that Again, not all of it. I think there can be positivities to fitness. Like again, like I said, I do yoga, and like for me, that's a way of reclaiming movement, and it's gentle for me, and so I like that because it's that gentle movement. Exercise, or just I don't even know if I would name it an exercise. I think I'd just say a practice. Like I see it more as a mental and emotional practice for myself.
Mhm.
Um, but I think when I look at some other exercise programs and things like that, there's this idea of kind of like push yourself to the absolute limit, and also like this idea of even if you're in pain, you just push past it and keep moving, which again is this whole idea of like not listening to yourself. And so not only are you now probably not embodied, but you're also now like intentionally ignoring those signals that are telling you to stop, or telling you it's too much, or telling you that you don't need that. And so that's something that I think also has to be examined too when we look at the intersectionality of like diet culture and fitness as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, that pain piece as well. It's almost as though that's part of it, like it has to
Yes.
come with pain, which is just
Yep. Hmm.
an interesting angle to take, given that this is something that we do to look after our
Yes.
mental and physical health as
Yes.
opposed to harm and damage it. That brings us then on to body liberation. And this is, and I have to admit, I have a lot to learn in this area of understanding like the origins of body positivity and how that differs from body liberation. So if you could help me on my learning journey and give me some pointers so I can carry on with my research.
Yeah, of course. And so, even going back to the history, like back to what we were saying about, black bodies being deemed as like, demonized and villainized and all that, and white women specifically, engaging in diet culture to distance themselves from blackness. When enslavement was over, and I mean, not initially, because I'm sure people were like not thinking about all this stuff immediately. They're thinking about survival.
Zoom cut out, but Alicia went on to explain who the original proponents were for fat liberation.
Queer folks, trans folks, folks of all identities and expansiveness, that were advocating for their bodies and their lives. As again time went on and they were emerging into society and trying to survive in this new world. They were advocating for themselves and they were showing up, in their bodies in the way they wanted to. And so essentially what happened was, a lot of people, like I'm thinking about writers that we know, like big name writers such as like Zora Neale Hurston and Audre Lorde, and again, those revolutionary thinkers again are just showing up in themselves. And so, white women in particular, use what they saw of black women being in their bodies and all that. Specifically for the women's rights movement as a way of advocating for themselves and their bodies. And so it's almost like they took it and they whitewashed it, and that's where we get body positivity.
Mhm.
And so that's just like body positivity is essentially the remnants of the whitewashing of a movement that was really started by black women, but then and queer folks and trans folks and gender nonconforming and expansive folks, and was just taken and then again, like most things, whitewashed and then turned into something different. So essentially that's what body positivity is, because it's saying all you have to do is be positive about your body and you'll be good. When in fact, what liberation really talks about is how am I free in the fullness of who I am? And so that's very, very different from I'm forcing myself to be positive, because you might not feel positive about every yourself every day, right? But you can aim to create a sense of freeness in yourself every day. And so I think that's what's different. And it's also like body liberation goes beyond just the idea of like the individual, and moves towards like how are we creating liberation for all bodies, like not just the ones that are societally acceptable, but also the ones that are being oppressed. So I think it's even deeper than like food relationship. I think it goes into what does it look like on a systemic level of like for bodies that are oppressed in all different areas. And so that's what I think about when I think about body liberation versus body positivity.
I love that. And I love that, like, the yeah, absolutely, we're not gonna feel positive about our bodies every day, but that doesn't that separation between positivity and freedom, liberation, that doesn't stop us from, but I might not feel positive about my body on one day, but that's not going to stop me from getting out and doing what it is that I need to
Yes,
do. Liberation, that's very different. And also, yeah, that sort of collective liberation of body as opposed to individual body, which is just, that's really, really powerful. Thank you for that. That's
yes,
absolutely brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. So, but this is something that I'm going to try and not be salty when I say this next part. It's probably going to come out so salty anyway. But so I don't know. So here in the UK, I think it's similar in the US as well, that dietitians are the only nutritional professionals who are who have a registered title. So
yes,
if you're a dietitian, you've done specific training and that's what makes you a dietitian.
yes,
I'm a nutritional therapist, and this is not this isn't a standardized training. So people who are nutritional therapists could have done all different types of training. We
yes,
don't. There's no sort of gold standard. So I understand why that can be problematic. One of the biggest issues I have here is we have this sort of I don't know if it's real, how real it is, but I definitely get this sort of pushback from dietitians that nutritional therapists should not work with eating disorders, and not really looking at the individual and even the training they've done. And also me knowing that the training that we have all done, as in like myself, the dietitians and nutritionists, is mostly again based on that whitewashed way of dealing with bodies, and a lot of the eating disorder training is still quite fat phobic, and it still has an air of weight, what could be dressed up to be called quote weight management, which is just
yeah,
still fat phobia, like let's call it what it is.
yep,
um, and I have definitely fallen, and this is where your podcast on my black body
yes,
was, this is why I just kept on having to pause it, because I am such a sucker for buying courses and getting certificates and to show, look, this is the work I've done, this is the studies I've done, da 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 da, and not actually thinking about what it is that I'm trying to do, which is just trying to jump through a whitewashed hoop to show that I am legitimate, and
yes,
that I'm legitimizing myself in order to work with eating disorders, when actually the work that we do isn't often the stuff that we are taught.
yes.
It's things that we learn from each other, and also what our clients teach us as well. So how would you describe some of the issues that you've come up against in that same area when it comes to working with eating disorders?
Yeah, and so I totally relate to everything you're saying. I think that what's really important and what I center in my work is lived experience, and so like, whether that's our lived Black experience, our lived experience of disordered eating, or our lived experience of just being in a culture that's inundated with diet culture. And so it's all being impacted by that on some degree. I really base it in that because you're absolutely right. A lot of these programs that are meant to quote unquote certify us are really based in white supremacy, and like that's the lens they look at. And so I'll give it a quick example of even for therapy. So mental health therapy, the origins of it, some of our founding quote unquote fathers of American psychology were proponents of slavery. They were proponents of saying that Black people were inferior. They even did research to like prove these things, right? And so like these are the people that started our mental health background and like your field in general. And so these are the people we're basing our like expertise in. And so when I think about like ascribing to these like titles and licensures and things, that's what comes up for me, because those theorists, we're still using them in all of our theory and work. We're still using research of people that support them or have not done their anti-racism work and all that, and are basing their research off of these biased perspectives. Their sample sizes might not even be Black people, and most times than not are not. And so that's what we're basing what makes someone credited or not. And so I don't really put my trust in that. And so when I think about like these hierarchies, I feel like when we think about it from that lens, it's really just classism. It's created to separate certain folks from being able to do the work. And so when I think about classism, I think about people who can afford certifications and people who cannot. And so that's a barrier that keeps people from being able to do these different things. I think about racial wise, if I'm trying to do a specific certification program, but every class I'm taking is like not catered to people in my community, then I'm going to have an issue with that. And I'm probably not going to be able to go through that program with ease as much as somebody else would be able to. And so I think that's where we get into some of that whiteness and white supremacy in these systems. And I'm sure there's just, again, thinking about other identities like ableism and, all other intersecting identities as well. I'm sure that there are remnants of that too, because when we think about who's doing our research, it's mostly cisgendered, white men, educated, married, like those type of status that a lot of folks don't have. And so I totally relate to what you're saying. And I mean, these programs are really not substantial. Like when we think about what they're standing for, like, oh, we're here to accredit someone, but you're accrediting someone in a limited perspective that's not really reaching the full and vastness of the population you're serving. So that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, oh, exactly that. And it's the same in the nutrition world as well. Like a lot of the studies that we're basing our evidence-based, nutrition off of are not
Yep.
studied on people that look like you or I. So
Yep.
it's kind of like, well, what am I learning? And then the other part is absolutely like having the resources of time, money,
Yes.
the support to go and do these certifications or this extra education. We don't all have that, so it is just another way that we get separated, yeah, from one another. So I am about, no, I was going to say a year and a half, but I'm pushing it. I'd say I'm around a year and 3 months into my anti-oppression work. A lot of
Yeah.
this language is still stuff that I'm still getting to grips with, which is why I love having these kind of conversations. I'm like, right, that's the term for that. Right, that's the term for that. Because I'm still just learning just how to communicate in a way that really speaks to anti-oppression, anti-racism, and body liberation as well. I'm still learning so much. But what I learned very early on in my journey, is how it affects my body and what
Yes.
comes up for me when I speak about certain things, and also when I don't speak about certain things, because I might not have the language, or I might not have the place or the space to do so. So
Yes.
I took a lot of naps. Around this time last year, I was taking a lot of naps. I love a nap, and there was a lot of naps, a lot of rest going on for me. I mean, part of it was kind of forced because we were in lockdown
Oh,
anyway.
yes.
It's quite convenient, me being home, because,
Exactly.
like I said, my body did need it, and I was always sort of just teetering on the edge of burnout. In Even though my capacity hadn't actually changed that much, my
Hmm.
capacity had changed, in that where my nervous system was, and I was full.
Exactly.
So I look after myself. If we're going to do this work, we have to look after ourselves. And so
Yes.
I'd love to hear how you look after yourself whilst doing this social justice work.
Exactly. And I totally agree with you. I'll even go back to last year, because really things for me really took off last year in 2020. Before that, I was just doing my therapy thing, my day-to-day life. And so when things kind of picked up, I was met with so much, I mean, I don't even really have the words for it, just to move from like having your 5,000 followers that you talk to every day to like 200 something thousand people wanting things from you and like not liking what you have to say, or wanting more labor from you. I mean, it was really a lot for me, and I noticed that for me, my nervous system was getting to a point where I was just kind of on go mode. So I was like going. I was overworking myself, but I wasn't really checking in to see like, how am I doing with this? Like, I was kind of in this daze, just kind of figuring out the movement. And I noticed for me, I was very tired, like emotionally, like I couldn't touch exactly what it was. Like it wasn't like I could go take a nap or take a vacation, because I tried that and it didn't work. It was like this deep emotional fatigue from like all of that, along with processing all the trauma. I was dealing with inflammation just from like the constant stress and chronic stress of it all. And so for me, I knew I had to do something different. And so my self care practice involves doing that yoga. Like I was saying earlier, yoga is an emotional and mental practice for me, in that it really causes me to ground. Like when my yoga instructor is like, remove your tongue from the roof of your mouth, I'm like, oh, okay. That I have been doing that. Or unclench your jaw. Like, you don't think about those things in your day to day. And so that's been really helpful. I'm also someone who's really into music. So I've always connected with music as an outlet. And so there will be times where like I'll literally just put on some music, turn off all the lights, maybe keep my like little lamp on or whatever, and I'll just be sitting with the music, or I might start singing with the music. And so that for me feels like almost like time stops and I'm just in that space. And so I really appreciate being able to like engage in that practice. And then I think too, for me, it's been that spiritual work. I'm pretty new in the spiritual journey. Like I grew up in a religious household and had, been pretty religious all my life, but recently have really tapped into more of this like African spirituality piece as a way of connecting back. And so that's been like really wonderful for me, just exploring and learning. And so I really have loved that as well, because for me, it serves as a source of empowerment of like, when everything feels, disastrous and out of control, and just like the weight of the world is on you, knowing that there's bigger things out there for you, and working in your favor and all that, that has been really empowering for me and really affirming. And so those are the things that I do for self-care. I mean, I also like do things like talk to family and friends and all the other stuff, but those are the really core things that I find really helpful.
Yeah, you got me I love music. Music is a huge part of my life and within my family as well, but for me, huge, huge part. But what I've never done, which I feel like I'm gonna definitely try, not turn the lights out.
Yes.
I like that. When you said that, I was like, "Ooh, that would kind of
Yes.
recreate." It just takes it out another sense, doesn't it? And then you
Yes.
really immerse in it. That is going to be my new thing. I'm gonna definitely give that one a go. But yeah, totally here on the music part. And although I'm a Pilates instructor, I do love yoga as well.
Yes.
And when you
Yes.
said take the tongue away from the roof of your mouth, I didn't do that, but I've noticed that my shoulder was like up here, maybe
Oh,
not the
yes.
front. I just dropped my shoulder. I was like, yeah, that's what I need to. That's my thing. Check in with that shoulder. Where's that shoulder?
Yep.
At?
I'm with you. I literally like most times do yoga for like shoulders and like neck, cuz like I feel like my neck and shoulders are always so tight. So, yeah, that I'm with you on that.
Brilliant. So courses are one thing that I spend all of my monies on, and the other thing is books. I love books. I mean, as I'm sitting here on my table, I've bought a new shelf. I've filled that shelf. I've still got piles of books on this table. It's just never ending, and I'm
Yeah.
still always going to ask my guests, um, what books are your favorites? What are the ones that have really made a lasting impression on you?
Yes. And so I will say that, so right now I'm currently actually working on a book. So I haven't had much time to read.
Yeah, you surprise us.
Yes, yes.
Nice.
So I'm working on my publication now. So all of my time has really been towards investing in that. But when I think about a book I really, really love, that's really influenced my work, is the book of Post Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy. Um, Wonderful, wonderful book. And I know you were saying earlier you wanted to get into that intergenerational part around trauma. Her work is really like the definition of that, and really helped influence my language and my learning around it as well. And so I love that book, Post Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And that's a book that I really have used when I think about talking about the intersectionalities of trauma, but then also like bringing in that lens of eating disorders for myself. I'm like, it all makes sense. And so that's a good one. And then I will say, not a book necessarily, but something I recently watched on Netflix is called High on the Hog. Have you watched it?
I've not, but also I'm aware that we don't always have the same shows here in the UK as we have there.
Okay.
But I'm gonna look it up. What's
Okay.
it about?
Yes, so High on the Hog, amazing show. At first, I was like, let me see. Like, it looked good, and I was like, it was about food. So I'm like, I wonder if it's like one of these cooking shows. But no, like it was this guy. He did this show. It's a 4-part series, and it goes into like the history of Black food, and how it has influenced the diet of like America, like the world, and like really goes into the history of like how different food sources got here, and like really breaks down like the colonization and how like essentially all food is our food, because I mean we made it, we made it great for everybody. And so yeah, like it was such a powerful show though. Like it was one of those where you have your box of tissues, you might feel the feels a little bit, but it was so great.
Oh, I really hope we have that here in the UK. I'm gonna look. I've only recently come back to Netflix begrudgingly. I've had to
Yes.
resubscribe. So that better be on there. So I'll have a look. I'll have a look for that. That's a great one. And post slave. What was the first? What was the book that
Oh,
you?
yes, it's post-traumatic slave syndrome.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I guess another one too, and I just thought about this with that one is My Grandmother's Hands. I know that was a big one
Yeah.
this year as well, and My
Yeah.
Grandmother's Hands really connected for me when it came to that embodiment and trauma too, with Resma's work around that. And so, yes, that was another one too.
Absolutely fantastic. But I've read that one, and that really helped me sort of understand racial trauma because it was definitely
Yep,
something that came up for me last year.
yep,
And that book was just literally, it was a godsend for me, and I've been following Resma's work since then. Just the way that he was able to explain
yeah,
the impact of racial trauma. But the thing that I really took away from that book, though, was the importance of community
yes,
and healing within our own communities so that we can all heal collectively together. And that
exactly.
really, really resonated because all I wanted to do when I was in that place, so this was on the back of the murder of George Floyd, I was
Yeah,
just in this, I just went into this spiral of just like suddenly felt like I would, like all eyes were on me.
yes,
All eyes were looking
exactly.
at black people. Suddenly didn't feel like I wanted, I mean, I had to go out to shops because no one else was going to do it for me, but
Yes,
was really having to think about my route to the shops and things like that, not wanting to be seen, all of that. And all I wanted to do was reach out to my family and my black friends. That's people who I hadn't even spoken to for years. Suddenly
yes,
we're all coming together and talking about how we were feeling and how we were doing and checking on each other. And that book really, really helped me think about the importance of community, which isn't something that,
exactly,
if I'm honest, I hadn't really thought about in that sense
exactly.
before. So
Yeah,
really
I
helpful.
would agree with you. I would agree. I think that for me, like I had this narrative of like, I can do it alone, but really getting into his work showed that like no, there's so much power in being able to like have people that look like you that are going through it with you. And so it really kind of recentered for me the importance of like building that community, which also led me to creating the Holistic Black Healing Collective, because I wanted to create that space. And so yeah, like that was such powerful work, and I totally agree with that.
Yeah, wow, amazing. I'm so glad you created that space as well. Well, I'll definitely make sure that there's links to all of your amazing work, wherever this post, which is likely to be on YouTube, but it also will appear on Instagram as well. So make sure all the links are included there. So this has been such a helpful conversation for me. I wasn't planning to get it transcribed, but I feel like I have to because I just want to see this all in words so that I can be
Exactly.
quoting you. And because I just honestly I feel like I learn so much when I listen to you speak, and I'm always so grateful for your words and the way that you explain things as well. And I just find it so helpful. So thank you so much. And before we check out, are there any parting thoughts, comments, or words of advice that you'd like to share with our community?
Yeah, and so I'll tell folks that, healing from an eating disorder, healing from racial trauma, is definitely a journey. And I will say it's also possible. And I think it's really possible. And what we were just talking about is it's possible within community and it's possible outside of the system. I think, one of the reasons why we're not getting better is because we're trying to heal in a system that wasn't created for us to be better. And so I do think it's time for us to build those new avenues of change for us to get what we need. And so I will also throw in a little tad bit that another community that I'm working on right now with a few colleagues is called the Black Body Liberation Collective. And so we're about to launch it soon. We haven't launched it yet. But essentially, it's that community. We want to create a space, a website for people to be able to like go on, share resources, connect with different folks in this work that we're talking about, that enter the field, because a lot of what I was hearing is that people that are coming into the field don't know where to turn. And so they end up getting into these certification programs with all these white folks or, all these other things, or clients, even people that are struggling with eating disorders don't have places to go. And so I will say that that's a community that we're going to launch soon. And then also, I also co-lead the Sage and Spoon Eating Disorder Support Group for Black folks. And so if someone is struggling with an eating disorder, disordered eating, or body image concerns, that's a group you can come to. It's global. And so you can join in from anywhere and attend, and we'd be happy to have you come with us. And so I just wanted to share that as well.
Oh, it's absolutely fantastic. I'm so glad. I'm really excited to hear about this new project as well. And yeah, I feel like we do. This is something we need now, right? We need
Yeah.
places where there are resources that we can share with each other. And what you just said there about like healing outside of I'm paraphrasing here, but
Yes.
healing outside of a system that was not created for us, that really struck a chord there for me, because that's been something that I've been thinking about, and just starting to think differently, starting to move away from that, and that's
Yes.
when I say that it feels so scary, but it
Yes.
feels so necessary.
Absolutely. Absolutely that. And I just want to thank you again for just having me on. It's so great to talk to you. And because I know we've been chatting for a while now, back and forth through the collective and on Instagram. And so it's so good to just see you and just have a chance to talk with you as well.
And I don't think it's actually really hit home that I'm actually speaking with you.
I
If
know.
I'm honest
I
with you,
know.
I'm gonna hang up and be like,
I know. Same to you as well. I'm just like so like I don't know. I'm just surprised that you can talk to someone from a whole different place, you know? Like it's night where you are.
nighttime, it's dinner time
Exactly.
almost. Yeah, no, thank you so much for taking the I mean, even when I asked you, I was thinking maybe she's too busy anyway. And you were like, "Yeah," and I was like, "Oh, she said yes. It's happening." So I'm so glad, and thank you so much for taking the time out. Just before we wrap up, if you could just let everybody know where we can find you and your amazing work.
Yes. And so, folks, if you have an Instagram page, you can find me on Black and Embodied. I'm on Instagram. And if you don't have an Instagram page, that's okay as well. I do have a website and it's blackandembodied.com.
Fantastic. Like I said, I'll make sure that all the links are available so people can find you with ease. Alishia, thank you so much for your time. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much.